Good to meet y'all. My name is Richard Stubbs. My colleague Nick Sorensen's with me. We're both been working together through a group we call Role Play and Grow out here in Oregon. I'm the one at 3 a.m. out in Oregon. He's actually on the East Coast, 6 a.m. there, so a little easier for him, but nevertheless works twice as hard as I do most of the time. So who are we? Role Play and Grow is an organization that trains therapists and educational professionals to use tabletop role-playing games for therapeutic and educational purposes. We really have been focusing in on social emotional learning. I'm not sure if that's the standardized language of how you describe behaviors that have to do mostly with social interactions in the UK or not, but out here it's kind of a big push in schools to help students with their behavioral health, their mental health by improving these skills. I am a private practice therapist as well, so I actually don't work in schools mostly. I work with kids outside of schools, and that's kind of what got started in terms of what we do at Role Play and Grow. We received in 2023 a grant for our school-based project through a group called Care Oregon. They're a Medicaid group, but it's government-funded insurance, and our grant basically said that we want to see a pilot program of using a tabletop role-playing game to teach social emotional learning and to help with executive functioning or behavioral health in schools, because the big push here was to try and get away from individual one-on-one therapy as much as possible to try and reduce the burden on our systems, at least in Southern Oregon. As a child and adolescent therapist, I have my wait list right now is probably a year and a half long. Just because of the amount of people get. And I also have a trauma specialty too. So it creates a big backlog. And we don't have that many child therapists in Southern Oregon. So they're trying to push for schools to have these interventions to kind of catch kids a little earlier if they can. We label it here in the United States under what's called tier program, a multi-tiered system of interventions. And you have tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And these essentially just involve more kids at the beginning and less kids at the end. So by tier 1, we're talking like universal program with students in the classroom. Tier 2, we're really talking about more targeted support. So smaller groups, people who've been identified in schools as needing additional supports around academic or social needs or behavioral health needs. That's kind of our background in terms of those two things. We were given our grant to try and reduce the level of tier 3 interventions. So we focused in on tier 1 and tier 2 and created 2 programs in a couple of different schools here. I trained a bunch of facilitators, and we focused in on 2. So the first we did this is a primary school level. So we were grade 4 and 5, which I think in the UK is 5 and 6, year 5 and 6. Anyways, ages 9 through 11. But essentially, that was my level. I did at tier 1, and we had a elementary school that took all of their students and gave them an offering of elective credits, which is not typical for our 4th and 5th grade years. So they said, we're going to give you a bunch of different options for classes. And one of them was a social emotional learning class using a game that we've developed called Legends of Lorem, with a simplified system and kind of external reward system that can be used in and out of game to upgrade their characters. So we used those in those systems. We can talk about each of those in a minute, what we did, but anything you want to add there, Nick?
No, I think that's basically what we started with. If you want me, I can jump in and talk about kind of what our paper discussed and where we're going.
Yep.
Yeah. So Richard brought me into this because I'm an avid TRPG player, but in a totally unrelated field. But I have a skill at publishing papers. And so he brought me in to help try to turn this into something that we can put out there for everyone else to use. And as we looked at the research, we noticed that there's very little to no discussion in the SEL education realm talking about the potential use of TRPGs in school settings. But there's a large and long history of discussions in like psychotherapy and psychology. Usually in the all of the examples that we found were based in the publication world, that were based on these tier 3 one-on-one observations that therapists saw and decided to publish as a case study. talking about the potential uses, like executive functioning skills is the term that came up a lot. And so we published our first paper just trying to bring the psychotherapeutic psychology discussions into the SEL discussions and say that both use different language, but they're meaning the same thing. And so we published a paper just recently that led us to this, that looked at all three of these levels and the potential use that TRPGs have and the impact that you can have at a universal level. But way before you need a therapist at tier 3, you can be doing this in classroom settings and in small groups before, just as the warning signs of maybe some social emotional learning deficits are coming into vision in their early elementary years, and start using this as one of the tools to bridge those gaps. And so we published that paper as we also were running these programs in various school settings. Richard was doing a lot of the tier 1 full classroom examples. He would go into classrooms of 20 plus students. Everybody in the class would participate for 6 to 8 weeks. We designed Legends of Lorem to be a rule system that could be taught in about 20 minutes. So it wasn't as complex as your traditional Dungeons and Dragons. And then we could jump right into what was happening. And then we also have another close colleague that has been doing most of what our tier 2 programming, and we'll get into kind of the specifics of what we did with each of these and what we're finding here in just a second. But the tier 2, she's a speech and language pathologist. She works with a lot of elementary age kids ranging from your kindergarten 5, 6, 7-year-olds all the way up to 11. And she has found very creative ways to use TRPGs to bridge speech gaps, reading gaps, emotional, like explosive emotions in kids that are just having some issues or delays in their social emotional learning or at home problems that are manifesting in school and classroom settings. And it's really quite creative what she's been able to do. And all of this being done at this tier 1, tier 2 level, well before a specialized therapist is ever needed to be brought in. And it's been really exciting to watch the potential kind of play out that we hypothesized in our first paper. And the findings are very positive. Richard, if you want to go deeper into what you've been doing with tier 1.
Yeah. So with our tier 1 program, we, like I said, we had kind of these different cohorts that would run for about 6 weeks at a time. Students voluntarily signed up for these. There were a couple of exceptions where the teachers thought, oh, this kid could benefit from this class, kind of misunderstanding the purpose of a tier 1. So they kind of sent us some kids that were probably more tier 2 level. They knew that being the head. The main issues that our principal that we were working with really wanted us to see was generally teaching some good social skills and decision-making skills, in terms of like how to handle a day and frustrations that come your way. But also she wanted to see if it could be a good option to identify kids who had not previously been identified as needing tier 2 services, at least those that are outside of the academic realm. Pretty quickly they can identify who's behind in reading and math and all the other academic areas. However, she was wondering if we were seeing deficits in terms of kids who had developmental delays or were masking from like an autism spectrum background, or in other words, just struggling in terms of just social interactions. So our tier 1 implementation process required about 6 weeks of actual play, and we had about 45 minutes for each class, which was a challenge for me, not being a trained teacher, working with them. And I was used to running games around 90 minutes in my private practice for group. But quickly we adapted. We tried a couple of variations of how to implement TRPGs at a tier 1 level. The first time I had a student intern with me, so I had some benefit for the first 2 cohorts where I had an additional person that had been trained to help run games. And we tried versions of just teaching the social emotional skills for a course or for 2 weeks, and then teaching the game for about a week, and then playing 3 weeks of the game with myself leading one half of the class and her leading the other half of the class. Biggest challenge being that we had about 20 to 25 students in each of these cohorts. And so if you're splitting the class in two and trying to run a game, those of you who are DMs know that having 10 or more players at the table can be quite a challenge. And that's what we found as well. Like, it was very difficult to run a cohesive or efficient game with 10 players at the table, especially with new players. We tried versions, second time around, we tried to kind of jump more into learning how to play the game right up front and just let the SELs kind of be taught inherently as we went over the skills as a class, like how do we take perspective of the players around us or the NPCs we're working with. And we would play the lessons into the game. We tried to run kind of a choose your own adventure style in that regard, where we had kind of a played out list and we would assign at a table of about 3 or 4 players a kind of sub DM. So we would tell a global story, and then we'd give this little map to the sub DM, who would then share their part of the story with their little team. And we ran it kind of as a war campaign where you had orcs coming in to invade a town and they were acting as the defenders. And so they would have their own little skirmishes in different parts of the town where they had to solve different problems that were given to them on each of their own little maps. And that worked pretty well. The big challenge being that we had to pull pretty heavily on students. For some of those groups, they didn't have, players who had played these games before. And so that goes about as well as you would expect. We had to do a lot of jumping in and helping, and that was okay. It went fairly well. Later implementations of this, we decided, I lost my intern at that point. She graduated and moved on to the next level, which was great. But I had the class all by myself at that point. And so I tried a new version where I would take the class and I split them into smaller groups of 2 or 3 players, and we had each of them create a character within those 2 or 3 groups. And the incredible work that came out of that was a really unique insight for me, because now we had small groups working on team work, trying to build a character together, and then they would interact with the story that I could tell to the whole class. So that worked a lot better in terms of the management of the group and overall some of the things we saw. And it was really kind of interesting to see what kind of themes would come up. We had one case where I played them through a D&D story, if you're familiar with, called The Keys of the Golden Vault. And we used that with the mechanic system that we developed through Legends of Lorem. We just used their story. And it was really fun to watch them. They had to save a museum with a eldritch monster egg that's being mistaken for a fancy gem, and they had to save the world from this monster. And the creative ways in which the whole class came up with to get this gem out. And I mean, they got to the point where they had to create a distraction and decided to lace all of the fancy cream puffs at the Supreme Gala with laxatives so that everyone would have to rush to the bathrooms. And the kids were laughing and having a lot of fun. And the principal walks in as we're talking about essentially poisoning an entire group of people with laxatives and stealing a gem. And she walks up to me and says, "You're doing great work." And that was kind of a funny moment there to kind of like this. We are, being absolute hooligans, and we're doing good work. So that was a really positive experience. We had, a lot of learning with the tier 1. It was a definite challenge. Some of the other creative implementation we saw at the tier 1 levels through some of our other facilitators is they would use it to teach history. So we had one who basically created characters that were on either end of Columbus coming to the West Indies. And so you had sailors that were from Spain and Portugal, and then you had native tribes people that were played by different characters, and they were given different resources and different tools, and they interacted within a story there to kind of highlight the challenges that we're running into with 2 cultures hitting each other. And that was a really effective tool. And I was really impressed to hear kind of the feedback from that. So there's other creative ways to imply it more than just social emotional learning, just for social emotional learning's sake, but it was used to teach history lessons with the social emotional learning component in a social studies class. So there's some creative ways that we can see that implemented, and would like to see more how that could be stretched out. Nick, why don't you talk about what we're learning right now from Kelsey? We've been doing interviews with her.
Yes. Do you want to hit the next slide for me? I don't think I have controls.
Good. So it should be on tier 2 now.
Yeah. So we started the interview where we're going through a long interview process with our tier 2, and then later we'll be doing tier 1 interviews for a tier 1 and tier 2 paper that we're hoping to get out later this year or early next year. We've been working with as a colleague, Kelsey. She's a speech and language pathologist that works in an elementary school. She has been working with kids ages 4 to 11 in this elementary school as a kind of a tailored, focused TRPG implementer among her other duties. Over the last year and a half, she's had about 45 kids go through her programs, and she runs on average 3 to 5 30-minute TRPG sessions using Legends of Lorem a week with small groups of 3 to 5 kids. The kids will stay in these groups for a minimum of 8 weeks, but some of them are in them all year long. And she's had about 45 kids go through her programs over the last year and a half. And she has come up with some of the most creative scenarios that we've her creativity is just through the roof. Richard and I have been dumbfounded at times at what she's come up with, but she's dealing with language problems and large explosive emotion problems, things that really disrupt the classroom setting. And these are students that maybe come from bad homes or have underlying issues that they need to deal with, but it's not usually quite at the level of needing a professional therapist yet, external and one-on-one. And so she's dealing with, like, one example she gave us was a third grader who is struggling writing their own name, let alone sentences. And so she'll come up with creative little puzzles or dungeons in which you hit a door that has a magical lock that you have to write something out to open the door and get the student through. So the student literally is handed a piece of paper and has to write it out. Or she'll create scenarios that require empathy and challenging of your own kind of preconceived concept. She's created this really creative NPC called Dave the Minotaur that she puts in almost every mission that she has, and the kids will come up and she'll show them a picture of what a Minotaur is and tell him he's cutting wood and he's angry and he's like huffing and puffing, and they see monster and they just go attack the monster and they'll hit him, and then Dave will start crying. And it's like, why did you attack me? I was just cutting my wood. And they start to realize that just because it looks like a monster, it doesn't mean it is a monster. And they'll have a small discussion about expectations and what this could be and, like, what's a different way you can handle that. And one of the great things about tabletop role-playing games is she can then say, hey, what if we rewind and go back to the beginning of that scenario and replay it? And they start having a conversation with Dave and realize that Dave is a really cool guy and likes to bake and has information about the town that they could have. And TRPGs are proving as a great opportunity to put weird, explosive situations in front of kids, both either ethical or doing things that trigger these explosive students into a rage, and then going back and trying to understand what the trigger was. And they have the opportunity to let NPCs die, and she's had some situations like where Dave dies and she doesn't bring him back, and they deal with the grief, and then they come up with creative ways to do really fancy funerals because they really liked him. And having a connection with someone and realizing, hey, we have to do something special to remember this, or to go back and to retry and to do things in a better way once they've learned new social or emotional skills. But one of the really cool things was Richard really developed Legends of Lorem to have internal mechanisms that can be rewarded external to the game. These grit points, things that you can spend. It's kind of like gaining experience in Dungeons and Dragons, only you can gain it by doing your chores at home or doing work in the classroom. So she'll have these sessions for 30 minutes with these students a couple times a week, but then she'll go and she'll connect with their teachers, tell them, like, hey, this is what this student wants to work on. These are where their deficits, he's blowing up or not getting schoolwork done or whatever it is. And this is the way you can reward him in the classroom, him or her. And so they'll start earning points from their teachers in the classroom and then bring those points to their session and get rewards in their sessions. And it motivates these students to make progress, not just in 30-minute sessions, but with their peers in the real world. And we're finding in our interviews that, especially in this tier 2, these small tailored groups is where tabletop role-playing games really thrive. And we're finding that there's many ways to do this in a therapeutic setting, but one of the interesting findings we're coming across is that oftentimes there's this gap between the adult authority figure and the student, and it's hard to connect with a student who's viewing you as the adult or the authority figure. And tabletop role-playing games are unique in that even though you're the adult DM in the room, as you put scenarios and NPCs in and you start collaborating on how to solve problems, the kids start to view you as a peer and the gap is shrinking and allows them to connect with students that maybe would take longer to connect with or have difficulty with authority adult figures. And she shared one example where a student who probably is on that line between a tier 3 and a tier 2 and may need one-on-one therapy with a larger professional in the future, was having a meltdown in the classroom and none of the teachers could get to him, and he just was screaming and thrashing and having a really big meltdown and struggling. This facilitator was able to go in and start using the language of their game. What would Dave think in our game? What would your character do in this situation? And because that gap had shrunk between her, he saw her more as a peer than as authority, and she was able to connect with him much quicker than any of the other teachers that worked with him quite frequently. And TRPGs have this unique, it's a middle ground between reality and your traditional SEL program where you teach a skill and hand a worksheet out and they give you the right answer even though they may not internalize it. And D&D creates this place where you can play with real world scenarios in a way that doesn't lead to an actual blow up and can discuss and rewind, and you bridge these gaps between, I don't know, a classic SEL example is you teach, a teacher teaches at the front of the classroom that Jimmy takes your pencil and you get mad, what do you do? And the students learn the right answer is say, I don't like that. But when Jimmy actually steals someone's pencil, then the kid punches someone in the face. D&D allows you to say, I want to punch him in the face. And then you can stop and say, is that really a good idea? Or an NPC could step in and say, why do you want to punch me in the face? And it causes the students an opportunity to confront real emotions and then get that first block of it before it actually happens and to start questioning what that impact would really be. And it's been a fascinating process to learn this.
Yeah, we got to pause right here though, because I think we're about out of time. So if there's any questions, we'll give you that